Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Vassell, and I'm the Assistant Vice President of the Office of Multicultural Advancement. And I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's Community Forum on COVID-19 and Social Justice. This program will be a panel discussion regarding the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on communities of color, as well as recent issues within our country regarding race and social justice, which will be led by members of the faith community. Toward the end of the program, we will have a Q&A portion. So please submit your questions using the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. To help facilitate the Q&A, we have the assistance of Reverend Dr. Charles Houston, class of 1990. Reverend Dr. Houston is the Associate Pastor of Counseling at Word of Faith Family Worship Cathedral in Austell, Georgia. He graduated from Syracuse University with a BA in mathematics and more recently graduated from Richmond Graduate University this past August with a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. Reverend Dr. Houston recently began a private practice therapy with Embrace Consulting in Hiram, Georgia. In addition to men's and marriage ministry, Reverend Dr. Houston is also a motivational speaker, author, mentor to men. And now I'm very pleased to welcome our host and moderator, SU alumnus, the Reverend Charles Wynder Jr. Reverend Wynder serves on the presiding bishop's staff of the Episcopal Church, where he works to enhance the denomination's capacity for advocacy, witness, and engagement to advance social and racial justice. A bivocational priest, Reverend Wynder also served for over 3 years as priest in charge of Holy Comforter Episcopal Church, St. Andrew's Parish, located in the Washington, D.C. area. Reverend Wynder earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in political science at Syracuse and was a Truman Scholar. He then earned a Juris Doctor degree at the University of Michigan Law School. He served as an attorney in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Corps as Deputy Commonwealth's Attorney, Executive Director of a federally funded legal services program, and Vice President of Programs for the National Legal Aid and Defender Association. He served several years as an adjunct professor at Hampton University, teaching constitutional law, civil rights, and civil liberties. Please join me in welcoming my good friend, the Reverend Charles Wynder Jr.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I'm honored to be here to participate in the discussion of the pandemic and how it has greatly impacted our community. And I am very excited and humbled to introduce our panelists. First of all, Bishop Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows. Bishop Jennifer is a native of New York City. She holds a bachelor's degree in architecture and a minor of urban studies from Smith College, a Master of Arts degree in historic preservation planning from Cornell University, and a Master of Divinity degree from the Church Divinity School in Pacific at Berkeley, California. She earned that in 1997. Before being elected bishop in 2016, she served in the Diocese of the Episcopal Church, in the Diocese of Newark, the Diocese of Central New York, and the Diocese of Chicago. She is the first Black woman to be elected a diocesan bishop in the Episcopal Church. Bishop Jennifer's ties to Syracuse University and to Syracuse, New York, run deep. She was ordained deacon at St. Paul's Cathedral in downtown Syracuse, and later served as rector of Grace Church and the Episcopal chaplain at Syracuse University from 2004 to 2012. And during that time, she worked in various ways on the Connective Corridor Initiative to remove barriers between the university and city residents. All of us who attended Syracuse know that that work is important work. In addition, through her food blog, Cooking in the Cuse, and as an editor for Edible Finger Lakes magazine, she sought to bring organic, healthy, and sustainable produce to the food deserts just off Syracuse University campus. Bishop Jennifer's expertise include historic preservation of religious buildings, social policy and transportation planning, fundraising, race, class, reconciliation, and spiritual direction. She is an accomplished distance runner, a triathlete, and a passionate chef and baker. She and her husband, Harrison Burrows, are parents to Timothy, their son. Join me in welcoming Bishop Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows. And now for an introduction to an alumna of Syracuse University, the Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland Toon. She is the Chief Operating Officer for the National Council of Churches. She's one of America's notable ecumenical leaders. Reverend Dr. Copeland Toon is a tireless advocate for justice. Ordained into the gospel ministry, she has worked for a number of faith-based organizations, and she previously served as National Council of Churches Assistant Director of Justice and Advocacy. In that role, she staffed NCC's Special Commission for the Just Rebuilding of the Gulf Coast. She distinguished herself in serving as the Director of Mobilization for the National Council of Churches Act Now to End Racism events. In 2018, she was given the President's Award for Excellence in Faithful Leadership at the National Council of Churches Christian Unity Gathering. Reverend Dr. Copeland Toon earned her bachelor's degree from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University, a Master of Business Administration from the University of Maryland, and a Master of Theological Studies from Duke University. She also has a doctorate in Metro Urban Ministry from New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Please join me in welcoming both Reverend Dr. Copeland Toon and Bishop Jennifer. Right, and now there are three. So I'm excited about this opportunity for us to be responsive, not just to Rachel's request, for us to engage in dialogue through a theological lens, if you will, looking through gospel eyes at this question of this triple pandemic, a pandemic in which COVID-19, racial justice issues, and then also what's going on with regard to economic insecurity have all come together in a way that have greatly impacted Black and Brown communities. But before we move into the core of our discussion, and given your pastoral and prophetic roles in the church and the larger community, let me start by sharing that this community of alums, of Black and Brown alums of Syracuse University has experienced a great deal of loss over the last 12 to 15 months. We've lost too many classmates. The anniversaries of these losses really began for many of us in just this past Labor Day weekend. And they'll continue the anniversaries into November, but we also just recently lost a classmate just days ago, Roland Bubba Grimes. Last Labor Day weekend, we lost Byron Zulu Franklin. Just days later, after she attended Byron's wake and funeral, the celebrations of life that followed, we lost Erica Branch Ridley. Then that last November, we lost Tanya Heidelberg Yap. But the tragedies of loss continued with regard to recent grads. There was a tragic car accident that took the life of Uche Chukwuma. She was a graduate of 2018. And then also, so young, Alan Gonzalez. He was to graduate in 20. So with regard to that, 2020 has been a tough for Black and Brown alumni of Syracuse University. The pain of these times for us as a community began in 2019. And so many of us flew from one location to another location or drove to celebrate life and to mourn, and then COVID hit. What pastoral message do you have for us?
I'll begin. I don't, the first thing is just to acknowledge it is an extraordinarily hard time. I've been trying to figure out how to contextualize this moment we're in, and the last number of years have just been some of the hardest years I think many of us experienced in our lifetime. I'm a Gen Xer, and so there's a lot of pain that I haven't been privy to, but I think even the ancestors would say that this is a moment that we're in that's perhaps like moments that we haven't seen for decades or centuries. And so for those who are grieving and just piling grief upon the many things that we have to bear in this time, I'm comforted by the notion that God is always with us in this. God is not somewhere else. God is not after the pandemic. God is not in another place. God is always with us, particularly when things are really, really tough. And the griefs are really, really heavy. And I would hope that this might be a source of comfort too. In our tradition, we believe in the communion of saints, that those who have gone before, who have passed on, whether it was yesterday or 100 years ago, that they are always with us. And that as the faithful who are still living this life on earth, part of what we're responsible for is to keep their memories and legacies and their names alive and known, and to have their memories be blessings, not only to us, but to those who will come after us, so that they ought not to be forgotten by those who have loved them so fiercely. And so they are still with us, not in the way that we might like it, because we always want people to be with us in the flesh here. But if they're not going to be here, I do believe that they are with us in spirit, and that cloud of witnesses is watching and walking with us still.
I would agree with that. I would also say, I wrote on Facebook, 2020 sucks, and I mean that in a deep and theological way, and got some interesting feedback. And I've said this a few times, and I do agree, Chuck, that it did really start last year, and some of the people you named had a profound impact on my time at SU and on my life. I actually met Tanya Heidelberg at a CBT, where she was just really pouring into us freshmen about her experience and everything. And Byron, there's just, I don't want to go into all of the ways that some of the people I knew who you named, Erica, impacted my life, but it was definitely meaningful. But I think, as a Christian, I come from a Baptist tradition. I really think that this is a moment for me where the scriptures come alive, the Psalms, the book of Psalms. We often, there's a tradition, even in Baptist life, that is you don't question God, you don't, you just kind of understand that God knows best. But I think there's also, when we go through scripture, we see that the prophets, that the people whose stories are told are like, God, what in the world is going on? And there's another way they say that, depending on what version you use, but my translation is what in the world, right? And so it's been a lot. It's been a season of loss. It's been a season of difficulty, of transition. I do want to say I am encouraged by the fact that my SU family is always there. I've made lifelong friends through SU who, regardless of what is happening, regardless of what I go through or they go through, that there's this a real community with students who went to SU, and I think Black and brown students, the CBT family. I always joke with my kids who went to HBCUs that we had our own HBCU at SU, and don't tell us we didn't. So it has been so meaningful to me, and I know to many of us, that we have been able to pull together and support one another through these difficult times.
Thank you both. It's, I think, significant to have your words with us, because we have not been able to gather to have this moment of time to collectively pause and reflect on how we move forward with these losses. But 2020 has been tough for the nation as a whole, and it's been particularly tough and had a disparate impact on Black and Latinx people. Of a triple pandemic of the coronavirus, the rampant white nationalism and white supremacy that continues to manifest itself in various ways, with tragic deaths of Black men and women at the hands of police, and the economic impact of the pandemic that is leaving so many of us either working as essential workers without adequate protection, and too many of us without jobs or economic security. The numbers of people who are food insecure in general, but then with Black and brown children and families, is stark. I have two questions for you, and you can place them in dialogue between you. Is how do you maintain hope in the midst of this triple pandemic? And in your ministries, what pastoral and prophetic messages have you been sharing?
Bishop Jennifer, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, one of the things I would say is I tend to frame this like this, that COVID is a pandemic, but white supremacy and anti-Blackness is the pre-existing condition that has made this pandemic far worse. What I say a lot around the circles I'm in is that pandemics like this, they accelerate and they amplify, and not always in the best ways. But we're certainly in a time where things that I think many people of color have been long aware of are being revealed in a new way to folks who have been able to have the privilege to not think about things like racial discrimination and socioeconomic challenges and things like that. But I'm really clear that for those of us in the United States context, that white supremacy and anti-Blackness and racism is the pre-existing condition that, a part of the markings and scars of the founding of this country, and that it's been a part of the challenge of being a person of color in this country since forever. So you put that's just been there, and it's been, the challenge that's killed us, that's tried to make us invisible, to erase us. And so that's been there. And then you put the pandemic on top. And so it should be no surprise that we are bearing an inordinate percentage of the effects of the pandemic, both in terms of deaths and cases and the economic effects, because the pandemic amplifies and accelerates. So I'll stop there, but I just want to kind of set that frame, because after the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the pre-existing condition will still be with us. And so I do have a piece of hope about that in this moment, but I'll stop there and pivot to Dr. Copeland soon to see what she might have to add to that.
So I think I almost remember very clearly the moment I was watching CNN, MSNBC, one of the news channels. And what we all know as people who live in Black and brown skin is you didn't have to tell us that we would be most impacted by this pandemic. I mean, because of health disparities, whether it's education, regardless of what the issue is, it always hits us first. I think it was MLK who said, if America gets a cold, Black folks get the flu, right? So you knew it was coming, but there was this moment where the statistics began to come out, and it was like, oh, it's just Black and brown people. They're the ones dying the most. And so let's open up, let's go back and get kids back in school. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like that there was this way that there were people who were dismissive of what was going on because they realized mostly Black and brown people, but it wasn't only Black and brown people, right? And so it's coming for you. It's not like, it's a virus. It's, it's not, you can't segregate a virus. You can't, put a virus off to the side or in its own community and think it's not going to come to your community as well. So I think that was a really stark moment for me. I told Chuck I wasn't sure if I was going to share this, but I think now is probably the moment to share it. I'm originally from Mount Vernon, New York. Shout out to Money Earning Mount Vernon. And, New Rochelle, which is right next door, was where the real epicenter began. So I was having a lot of texts and calls and posts and you name it about people who were either getting the virus or whatever. So my mom, one of her best friends for over 50 years, died early on in April from the pandemic. Just really was a heartbreaker. Following that, there were others. And on Sunday, we found out that my oldest aunt, who's the matriarch of our family, has COVID. And she is 93 years old. She's right now in the hospital. They have not great news for us, but we hold out hope. But not only does she have it now, but her daughter, who's my cousin, her granddaughter, and her great-grandson. So we are looking at, a really difficult, challenging situation in terms of our own family and how it's impacted. So this strikes me on a number of different levels. It strikes me because, my aunt has been, she was a teacher for years, a celebrated teacher, an award-winning teacher. She used to be a poll worker, an election judge. She's gotten certificates and citations and you name it because of this. Funny story, and I'm going to try to make this quick. I was in Durham, North Carolina when I had both of my children. I'm literally in labor. I had a Black OBGYN. Turns out the doctor was taught by my aunt in Sally, South Carolina. And so how that conversation came up takes much more time, but he knew her, remembered her, and we got her on the phone and she remembered him, right? And had things to say about him because that's the kind of person she is. And so part of me is negotiating, honestly being angry because I don't feel like my aunt, after all she's given, after the fights that she has fought, not just for her students, but also for me, for all of us to be able to vote, all of that, why should she have to suffer at this moment and die in this way? It really is a hard place to negotiate. And I do feel like there has been a lack of leadership. One of the earlier Ramon Escobar from CNN talked about the importance of leadership. And it just seems to me with some strong leadership, we could be New Zealand, or we could be Canada, or we could be another country that's not quite impacted like this. So there's so many things I think that are converging in this moment. And I 1,000% agree that at the core of a lot of this is that pre-existing condition. I love that framing of white supremacy and white nationalism.
Yeah, so I will keep your family in my prayers. I am so sorry. And I, pray that the virus will, work its way out and they'll be okay on the other end of it. But I know it's hard. I don't think, every now and again on social media, there'll be one of these polls, on Twitter. Like this tweet if you know somebody who's died or who's been impacted by COVID. And I'm going, oh my God, does anybody not have that? Like who has not been impacted? Who's not paying attention? So, and I'm aware that, I serve a predominantly white church. And when I began to close congregations in our region of central and southern Indiana, because it was the necessary thing to do, to close church buildings, keep the church doesn't close, but the buildings do. Folks were like, well, this seems so like we don't know anybody who has COVID. And I already had 5 people who had passed away by that time. So in April. So, again, that's another mark of the sort of privileged piece about how distant you can be from all of this. And Black and brown people typically, we just don't have that luxury, that privilege. I also want to say too, Chuck asked about hope. on the days in which I'm not so hopeful, you know, and I think the older I get, the less I believe in conspiracies, but plans. Like, I just think there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. You know, I've taken to studying the roots of our eugenicist histories in this country, and the universities that funded that research. You know, places like University of Vermont. People wonder why there are no Black people in Vermont. I'm like, well, University of Vermont like had studies to organize and to like breed people out. Like, that's how that happened. So, but you know, on my bad days, I go, this COVID is another way for white supremacy to eliminate populations, right? And I feel, and we feel that personally as Black and brown people. I mean, it's personal. It's us. And so to not be paying attention to that intersection is to not be doing the work. And so looking at how like there's this undercurrent always, and it shows itself in who's getting affected most heavily by the COVID-19 virus. But I think, as Chuck alluded to, the economic effects, the ways in which being separated from each other physically has an effect, the loss of jobs, all of those things. And it's got that same root of, you know, white nationalism and racism. But my hope is that, you know, I'm always looking for where's the place where we can see the silver lining in the midst of the tragedy? Where is the gospel light in the midst of the darkness? And I think it's that we're in a moment where folks who are really showing up as true allies, and not just for performative allies, are able to step back because we're not rushing around and doing the things that we were doing before the pandemic in terms of not having a minute to think and reflect. And folks are beginning to go, oh, wait a minute. Like, it is coming for Black and brown people, but it's coming for us in the other ways. And we would be smart to actually be paying attention and asking different questions. And so we're having a more sustained conversation about racial justice in this country than I've seen in my life, in my adult time. You know, I think in terms of a public, visible, ongoing conversation at varying levels of society in a very public way, makes me wonder if there are some gains we can make there. And for sure, some of that is a performative, well, you've got to say something about Black Lives Matter, because if you don't, people will call you a racist, even if your policies betray you. But there are those who are really trying to come alongside and to do the work and to transform the systems of injustice that affect so many of us in this country. And I'm hopeful about some possibilities of change there.
Yeah, I definitely feel hopeful about the possibilities. I have those days too where I'm like, okay, Jesus, like, for real, like, we need some movement, like, now. Enough of this, right? And so, and part of it, I am in policy spaces. The fact that there hasn't been another COVID relief package literally makes my insides like burn on fire on a regular basis, because I know those people, right, who lost their jobs. I know those people, they go to church with me, who don't have what they need, who are really struggling even all the more to make ends meet, people who are impacted, people who are sick. And it is inexcusable, and that is not partisan, that is Jesus, that it is inexcusable that we have not taken care of the least of these with another relief package. And so, but there's an election, there's long lines, which is not really to celebrate, except there's a lot of people coming out. It's voter suppression, that's a different panel, I think. But, you know, there is hope on the horizon. We just got to do our part. We got to wear masks, whether we like it or not, and social distance. That brings hope, that brings life to those who we might impact. Even if we think we're okay, we might think we're okay, but just not have symptoms. And I think there's lots of little ways we can make hope happen, right, in our daily lives, so that we're not overwhelmed by how crazy, I mean, it is really crazy, we gotta say. It's like crazy, right? So whatever that is, whatever category that is. But we can bring hope into the spaces where we are by, you know, doing our part. We can't do God's part and we can't do other people's part, but we can do our part.
So thank you both for that. And Leslie, thank you for sharing your family story. And please thank your cousin for all of us for not only giving you permission when you checked in with your immediate and extended family, but saying, no, please share the word and the message. So thank you for that. And I'm we got a couple more questions going, but I want to sort of fold one that we had talked about earlier into this before. There are some folks who will look at the personal, just prayer, and that the response as people of faith is only prayer. That as people of faith, there's not a response that involves justice making, protest, and engagement in the public square. And so I want to integrate that into this next question, and then go from there. Emily Towns writes about a different type of everydayness. Some folks will just focus on the everyday. I'm going to pray. And of course, we all know that prayer changes things and prayer is important. But she talks about a different type of everydayness, one that works to disrupt the hegemonic grip of evil, some of the evils that we just talked about. Eugenics is evil. White supremacy is evil. You're both familiar with her writing, but for those who are not, let me share some of her words she wrote in Womanist Ethics, Cultural Production of Evil, where she addresses the dismantling of systems of oppression and evil. She writes that it is what we call in Christian ethics the everydayness of moral acts. It is what we do every day that shapes us, and where both the fantastic hegemonic imagination and the challenge of hope to dismantle it are found. It is these acts that we do that say more about us than those grand moments of righteous indignation in action. The everydayness of listening closely when folks talk and don't talk to hear what they are saying. The everydayness of taking some time, however short or long, to refresh ourselves in prayer and meditation. The everydayness of speaking to folks and actually meaning whatever it is that's coming out of our mouths. The everydayness of being a presence in people's lives, the everydayness of designing a class session or lecture or reading or writing or thinking, the everydayness of sharing a meal, the everydayness of joy and laughter, the everydayness of facing people who expect us to lead them somewhere, or at least point them in the right direction and then walk with them. The everydayness of blending head and heart, the everydayness of getting up and trying one more time to get our living right. Then she closes. It is in this everydayness that we, the people, are formed, and we, the people of faith, must live and be witness to a justice wrapped in a love that will not let us go, in a peace that is simply too ornery to give up on us. How do you respond to her and to those of us who would want to sit in a comfort of personal relationship only, without engaging in the spiritual journey of accompaniment and justice making and community lament, and focus on an everydayness that places us in relationship with God and the people of God? How do you respond?
It's beautiful to be reminded of her words. The eloquence is like, oh yes. Because I just hear that and it resonates as gospel truth to me. I've been trying to remember who gave me this quote, and because hearing people talk all the time, but they said, we'd like to attribute when good things happen or when things that are transformational happen as grace. And I'm like, yeah, grace is grace of God, sort of making things happen. But he said, but even grace needs an assist. And I'm like, yes. So, we pray, the foundational, but we also, prayer is not the only response to God's love and action in the world. We're called to actually do things. And what I've wrestled with folks in my care a lot is people feeling paralyzed and stymied about, well, what can I do? It's a pandemic. I'm trying to, barely get through the day. I can't get my basics covered. What else can I do? And I think the call always, whether we're in a state of emergency or pandemic or not, is to figure out, well, what is the one thing, like we can get overwhelmed. And that's why I love Dr. Talon's words, because it's not just, I got to do all the things. I have to be on the protest line 5 days a week, sort of risking my health. If that might be, but it might not be. There may be another thing. So the thing is to, in your prayer, figure out what is that one thing. And maybe it changes over time. And so here's a victory I'll share. We're in a pandemic, and, after George Floyd's murder and just all the other countless assaults on Black bodies, there have been folks who have been demonstrating nonstop and trying to then not just show up to the demonstration, but to be working on the stuff in the inside to actually overturn the things that keep oppressing us. And so we just, in the last couple of days in Indianapolis, working with a collaborative network through our community organizing group and others, and anybody, frankly, who's going to get it kind of come along, we finally were able to get our city county governance to pass a measure that gives civilians the majority on the police board. It's an oversight board. So this way, like now we have some transparency, we have some more accountability broadly. So it's not just policing, but we've got some civilians there. And that was something that happened in the midst of the pandemic, because we had to figure out, like, who are those folks who can get that done, and let's make the way. And so there's a lot of way making that's possible in this time. We know God always makes a way, but we can do something, we can assist, and we got to figure out, like, what is it that I are called to do, and then to do it, and then to stay past the pandemic like a dog on a bone on getting the stuff done. Because the other thing I've seen is people, are hungry, and we're trying to respond to hunger needs in our communities. And every church we have in our region, and an Episcopal church in our diocese, has a way of feeding people one way or the other. We have churches with 40 people on a Sunday making 200 meals a week for folks on a Wednesday afternoon, right? But in the pandemic, they had to pivot. And I said, okay, that's great that you can pivot and respond to those hunger needs. But if we are not also working to figure out why people are systemically hungry all the time, and we accept it as normal, and we have created a system whereupon the government assumes that we will just be there, well, they're killing us, by the way, but that we'll just be there to continue to feed people and respond to that gap, then we're not doing what I think God called us to do, which is not just to speak out to the injustice, but to transform it. Like, it's got to be dismantled. And there's a lot of work to do. So what's the one thing? And then if you can do more, but, pray and act.
Yeah, I know David Beckman, who was head of the Bread for the World, he said that if every single church in the nation were to try to take over what the government does in terms of feeding people SNAP programs and other programs, they would spend about $750,000 just on that a year, every single church. So I'm thinking maybe that won't be the way to go, but that we really have to be advocates for policies that make sure that people are not hungry. And so, I think, we make something, there's some things that I think are not just political, but it really is about being a good neighbor. It's about being, from my tradition, a disciple of Christ, in that we want to make sure that, as you're saying, that it's not just, yes, when people are hungry, you want to give them a meal, right? So that's benevolence, that's charity, but there's also justice. So we want to make sure that people have the tools that they need so they don't have to keep coming back to the church. That makes people feel good, like, oh, I'm feeding people, but it's not about you. We need to empower people so that they have their own sense of dignity and they don't have to keep running back asking for help because they're starving. And I think, that's a part of what's happening with this pandemic, that we really have to look at all of the systems. We know that there's some Black and brown kids who are not engaged online, right? Who are falling even more behind. What are we going to do about that? We don't need to wait for some test to come out a year from now. We know that's happening even right now. So we need to be holding people accountable. We need to support teachers who are stretched beyond, et cetera, et cetera. And to the prayer piece, I was arrested in the Russell Senate office building, somewhere around Mitch McConnell's office, just to mention. And I would go back again, praying actually, because the US Capitol Police believe that prayer is protest action. So when the officer told me that, I was like, I'm Baptist, that works for me. It is protest action. We protest you trying to cut healthcare. We protest you trying to cut SNAP. We protest you trying to separate families at the border. So I was all in. I was like, yes, this is exactly where I need to be. But I think, that, we talk about in Christian traditions and other traditions as well, that we have free will. But I believe God gave us free will with expectation, right? The expectation is that with your free will, you're going to help your neighbor. You're going to help other people. You're going to help and make sure this is a more just country. What does God require of us? And so even when we look at, individual salvation, even biblical texts show that individual salvation has communal responsibility, that it's not just about the individual. The woman with the at the well, after she met Jesus, she ran to tell her whole community, come see a man who told me all about myself. And there's example after example. And I know it's not, excuse me, just in the Christian tradition, because I do a lot of interfaith work. I know that others also have this same mindset and the same really mandate to be good neighbors, to love one another, and love in community. We can love each other as individuals, but love in community has to be played out through justice. Bishop Peter Story from Duke was one of the people who worked on apartheid in South Africa. Was one of the first people I heard to say that. But love and community has to live itself out through justice.
So thank you both. And we've got time for one more question from me here in Concord, New Hampshire, before the rest of our community poses some other questions. So, the election is around the corner. And, polls are up and down. And when Bethany and I moved from DC up here to Concord to serve as chaplain and teacher humanities here at St. Paul's School, and Bethany's doing director of DEI initiatives here at the school, we see a lot of Trump signs. We're starting to see more Biden signs than we anticipated, even outside of Concord. And some polls are showing that Biden is ahead, even in New Hampshire. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we all know we need to register to vote. We need to get out to vote. Some people have same-day voting. There's an opportunity to go to the polls and to watch the polls and be a poll watcher to make sure that suppression doesn't happen in real time. The election's around the corner. The question that there's four questions that I'm posing, really just to stimulate your conversation, and then we'll close in about 12 minutes to open it up. Is what should we be doing? What posture should we take as we wait for the election results? What is our work if we have 4 more years of the same administration? And then what is our work if there's a new administration? And there may be another question you choose to answer, but what's up with this election around?
What's up with the election around what? I'm sorry, I missed that.
The election's around the corner, so what should we be doing and how should we position ourselves? And is the work different if what's our work depending on the outcome?
Well, it's a lot of what I just talked about, praying and keeping at it, right? Like, I think, I have a hard time actually fathoming like what's going to happen on the other side of election, vote, the end of voting. So I voted yesterday and got it done in Indiana. And, I live in Indiana. And the hard thing with the Episcopal Church is wherever I am, there's like this little bubble. It's like these Episcopal bubbles, which don't look a lot like politically more conservative Indiana. So just state that. So I've been digesting the piece that just came out electronically in the New York Times. The editorial board has written one of the most brilliant and detailed pieces naming the strains of the current president and the stresses and the impacts. I mean, it is a brilliant piece. I recommend you go look at it immediately or wait for it to come out on Sunday in this whole package. But there's a line that caught my eye that I wrote down this morning. I haven't consumed it all. I just read the opening editorial piece. But it said that if President Trump loses, Reconstruction will require many years and tears. So I've been thinking all just this morning about the work of Reconstruction in our time. And I really believe that there's going to be a kind of Reconstruction that we're going to be in the midst of, probably one way or the other, but with a different kind of direction and support if President Trump is not reelected. If he's not reelected, we'll have so much repair work to do at the most foundational levels of our democracy that's going to consume us, I think, for the rest of my days on this planet, however how long I'm given to be on this planet. I think that will be the work of this country, is some reconstruction, some reordering of things that have come to light in the time that we've had this pandemic and the issues we've been naming, and some hope there. But there will be years and tears as we do that. And so as someone who has cared for a diocese that's complex politically, and that, I recognize that there will be upset and fear and anguish, no matter how the election goes, trying to figure out then if President Trump is reelected, how then do we hold this very broken body together? And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I believe that's what's going to need to be done because the body will be bleeding out.
I keep joking we're gonna open back up the Underground Railroad and sneak into Canada.
Oh no, not joking.
So there's that. But I do think, so first of all, I hope that everybody is registered and that you have a voting plan who's listening, that you have figured out how you're gonna get there, all the particulars of what that will look like. I've been encouraging churches, sororities, fraternities, civic organizations, whomever you are, if you have a social justice ministry or outreach or whatever you want to call it, to maybe the polling place that's near you, take little bottles of water. You can have your wipes to make sure you wipe everything down, take snacks for people. Just this week, I was saying, oh my goodness, after seeing all those lines, we need to have folding chairs, like churches can take folding chairs and of course, wipe them down, etc. But to really have a presence at the polls, there's a group of clergy that are asking for poll chaplains so that people will go to the polls and just have a presence. I actually did that in Georgia in 2018 with a white female colleague minister of mine. And we were outside just kind of like, we're here, how are you doing? Just having that kind of calming presence for people. We obviously, I think people should, have your plan, take a friend, make sure, check with your people, make sure they're gonna vote. Now, I will say things that I don't know if this is true, because I don't serve as a pastor of a church body. I am on associate minister and have been on staff at churches. I'm pretty consistent, but I will just say, I don't feel like when I say we're voting for certain particular things that I'm being partisan, because my lens is Jesus. My lens is Christ, right? My lens is the gospel. So I feel that like deep in my soul. And so sometimes I know I wrestle up against people, but I don't really report to you. So I say that in love. Like, I feel like I have another boss and I would much rather you be mad at me than have to deal with my relationship with God. So I have been to the border twice, right? And I have sat with families who were just coming here and having that experience. I have sat with churches that are being welcoming places to families that are coming here and hearing their stories. I have lost sleep and shed tears over children being separated from their families at the border, because the deep impact of that is generational. It's horrible in so many ways. So I'm voting for those kids. I'm voting for the teenager and the families that I met. I'm voting for healthcare, because I think in America, people should have healthcare, especially in a global pandemic. And I am completely offended through my soul for a country to be having its government trying to end healthcare for everybody at a time where everybody needs healthcare and quick access to healthcare. I'm voting because I know that families are struggling right now. People have lost jobs, and it makes no sense to me that we would stop food programs and hinder food programs like SNAP that people will give people access to food at a time like this. And yet we have an administration now that tries to cut SNAP every single time it comes to the floor, every single time there's a budget. And so, I feel like these are justice issues. I feel like these are loving my neighbor issues. I don't feel like it's partisan. I feel like it is what God calls me to as a disciple of Christ.
Amen.
And
So-
I'll end there. I can go on, but I'll just stop there.
Well, I'm grateful to both of you. I read the script. I got a little stuck there in the beginning because I thought I was going to be able to put it up on my screen as a teleprompter, and it wasn't working. So I had to go with the paper. Thank goodness for paper. But what I didn't read, and having been scrambled a little bit, I didn't embed, is that, I've known both of you for some time, and I've seen you in your work, and I've seen you in your ministry. And so it's been meaningful to have you all in dialogue. And I know that you all will be in relationship anew beyond our time together, connected through Syracuse, because of your work and your ministries, they intersect. But I have loved working with you, Leslie, in those spaces, church-wide spaces around the country and around the church, and observe you lead and follow your direction. And I have Bishop Jennifer, much of who I am and becoming, as you reminded me in email communication just a little while ago, started 15 years ago when you were answering some seemingly innocent questions from Bethany and me, and along the way, guided me and accompanied me. And I appreciate your affirmation of Bethany and my new joint ministry. And again, just like with Leslie, I continue to follow your lead and your guide. Of course, Chase thinks that Rachel's my boss, but I've got a lot of strong women around me that I report to. And the Holy Spirit's a woman too. So she has moved, and we are at that hour. And as much as Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland Toon and Bishop Baskerville-Burrows and I would love to continue our discussion, it is time now to hear from you, our audience. And Charles Houston, Reverend Dr. Houston, can you share some of those questions? And we're right on time.
Yes, sir. How's everybody doing? Awesome job to our panelists. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm greatly honored to be able to moderate this portion of our forum. I also would be remiss if I did not mention there is someone near and dear to our hearts who also passed earlier this year, who's a Syracuse graduate and alum, and that was our good friend, Melvinia Hardiman. She was a part of the class in 1990 as well, and I just wanted to send an earthly shout out to our heavenly friend who is with the Lord right now. As you can also see, I'm not moderating this portion by myself. I have my good friend Otto to the left side of me, on my left shoulder, on my back. And I just want to say it's always a blessing to have someone who knows Jesus and someone orange to have your back. Somebody say amen.
Amen.
Wonderful, wonderful. So now we're going to get directly into our questions. We have some really good questions, and I just want to go ahead and get into the the meat and the heart of that. The first question is professional counseling has not always been embraced by the Black community. Do you recommend that those who are having difficulty getting through the pain of loss and the current environment seek professional help? And how do we shift the perception of mental health in our communities? So it's kind of a two-part question. And I'd actually like to hear from both persons on the panel.
Yeah, I mean, it's a short answer. I would say, please seek that help. One of the things I think that's so important in the Black community particularly is that we don't talk about our mental challenges. At least, I mean, if we do, we tend to make light of them and cover it up with a kind of a humorous take. And these are really serious issues. The levels of mental challenges, from eating disorders to other kinds of just sort of run-of-the-mill, like it's hard, you know, psychological times that we can find ourselves in. Like, we need to find and normalize the notion that you can just go get help. You know, I remember seeing my first counselor when I was in college, and it just, you know, whenever I might need that help, it's just been a part of my pattern of life. And I've been really clear that talking about that with my family and with other members of my community is important, so that it doesn't become a big thing. It's just like, oh no, this is how I care for myself. We talked about meaning self-care briefly earlier today. And often it doesn't need to be a huge crisis for us to then seek out that kind of therapy. I think it could be just, you know, we're feeling like it's a hard time and we want someone else to help us with that. So I encourage us to find ways to talk about it as we talk about, you know, anything else that's quite an important part of our lives. And then there are some resources that are really easily available with a search or asking a friend. You know, if you need the help, also ask, you know, find the strength to ask. And you might be surprised where someone might say, oh yeah, me too. Here's a person I might recommend.
I think, you know, yes, please go see a counselor. There are also Christian counselors if you want someone who's more specific to your faith tradition or other traditions as well. You can certainly search those people out. I can imagine anybody who's not having some challenge at this time, right? I mean, it's a lot going on, a lot of things converging. It's a lot of stress, you know, and so I would say, as Bishop Jennifer said, that, you know, it's self-care. You want to be healthy, you want to be whole. I will joke with people sometime, like counseling will help somebody from getting cussed out. And, you know, you can cuss people without cussing people, you know. So it can save relationships. It can help you just negotiate difficult spaces. So I think, you know, in all seriousness, I do want to say that if you're having any problem, or if you feel like maybe this would help, you're talking to your friends and that's not really helping, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And in fact, it could be a life-giving moment to seek some, you know, somebody who's neutral, who can just hear you and help you and guide you and direct you.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. I just want to kind of chime in before I ask the next question to say that I'm a huge proponent of self-care. I did graduate from Richmond Graduate University. The Lord sent me back to grad school after achieving some spiritual degrees to give me some balance. And that's a challenge that I see in our communities, in our African American and Latino communities. There's a stigma against mental health and seeing a counselor and a therapist, but we need to get to the point where we recognize that both are needed. There's a balance that we need to obtain and achieve in this world that we're living in, especially with 2020 type issues that we're dealing with right now. Depression and anxiety are very real. Stress is a common thing, and we need to learn better ways on how to manage those things and self-regulate on a day-to-day basis, in addition to our prayer. So our next question is, many of our allies in and outside of the US have reached out to us on how they can help address the social injustice issues in America. What words of advice do do you guys have for them?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think that our allies are trying to work channels. Well, I shouldn't say I think. I do know that they're working channels and trying to be supportive and present in different ways. You know, who the ally is depends on the issue and the issues that are happening. I can say more about what I would like to see, and maybe others can. I think it's very tricky because this is the United States. And so some things and some responses, I think that some nations would have, if some of what's happening here were going on in other places, I think people are a little shy about having those types of responses. I mean, you don't even really hear strong condemnation of certain things. Like you might in, say, other places like Syria or Lebanon or some other places where there's turmoil in the world. And I understand it's a really difficult place for some nations to be able to say certain things in the way they might say it if we were not America, if we were not the United States. I would say that I hope that they will continue to show up and to be supportive. I think the marches and all of the outpouring of support around the world after George Floyd's death really was the world letting us know we got you. You know, we have your back, and we see you, we hear you. We also, in some cases, are dealing with these issues, but we have you. We are your allies in this, and I think that we should really take great joy and comfort in.
Yeah, here. I mean, right on with that. Nothing new to add. I remember back in January, as we were anticipating this every decade or so gathering in the Anglican world of gathering all the bishops across the Anglican communion. It's like, 1,000 bishops or something coming together for 2.5 weeks, and it was canceled because of the pandemic. But as we were approaching going to this gathering with great anxiety, some of us in the American context were saying, we're going to go as America, and it's always a challenge when you do that, sitting with folks who are in a really different kind of circumstance, economically particularly. And what we said is we need to come in there with some humility and just to say, we are in trouble. Like our country, we are in trouble. This is January, we had this conversation. So, that gathering's been put off to 2022 now, but the message is the same. And so I think if the allies, domestic and global, can stay with us and to know that, to help see us through, because there'll be another side to this current moment. I mean, God gives us that promise, there will be another side. So we hope that folks will be standing steady with us. And I trust that even though that there's not some of the best policies perhaps operating at the upper echelons of governance, that the people on the ground have a different view. And I think that, and as Leslie mentions, looking at some of the demonstrations across the globe, like we are seeing that happen, like we get it, and we're not powerless, and we know how to connect with each other on the ground across these countries. So our allies are, much broader than some of the international organizations that might have bound us together for foreign and economic interests. People on the ground are now connected. And I think if we can keep those relationships, we'll be able to walk as allies in various ways on the other side.
Can I add something I just remembered? Chuck and I were actually in some meetings at the UN, and they have this is the decade of people from African descent. And so there's a lot of work, a lot of talk being done about reparations and other ways that white supremacy, white nationalism has shown up around the world. And being in conversations in those spaces, we were writing a letter to the State Department that we signed on that, well, it hasn't gone anywhere, but asking for the special rapporteur on racism, xenophobia, religious intolerance, and I think there's one other part of that title, to come and do an assessment of the US. So stay tuned. I mean, there are things happening in the global community of people trying to show up and to really not overlook some of what's happening here.
Reverend Dr. Charles, can I say something just briefly?
Yes, sir, please.
Sure. So you know, Leslie's right, and that was some good work, and it continues. And you know, to me, it was, as we sat in those halls a couple different times and with different partners, it reminded me that some of the, I don't want to say progress because it suggests that everything goes forward, but some of the good traction that we got and impact that we had regarding in movements was when Black people in the United States and Black people in the Caribbean and Latin America and Europe and Africa came together and strategized together and leveraged what one another's could do, the gifts, the talents, the positions we had, and really create a situation where, you know, the powers had a hard time mapping and understanding how to respond. But there was power in that organization. There was power in sharing tactics. All of them did not apply equally, but we were in relationship. And so when we've come together in those spaces, it's been powerful to hear the special rapporteur give a report talking about reparations. When we oftentimes think of it only in the United States context, but CARICOM and Caribbean countries have actually sued a number of European countries for reparation. Because the wealth in those countries, just like the wealth here, it's come from us and our work. And so she talks about a frame of reparations, which talks about development and deals with colonialism, as well as, you know, this impact on those of us who are living and residing in the West. And so I think there's ways that we should get back to and can get back to, and you know, those types of active dialogue and conversation on the ground and in our organizations. So when we win as people of faith with other people of faith to be in dialogue and conversation and even speak from the tables of the UN. And the thing about it is this: if we allow ourselves, people of faith, whether it's Christian, you know, Muslim, you know, other faiths, we have language and concepts that directly intersect with human rights language. And if we move beyond a frame where we allow the secular text of the Constitution to confine our imagination and have a prophetic imagination in which we take the Bible and the newspaper and take and put them in dialogue the way Bishop Jennifer did earlier, and use our spiritual language and theological language and what we know, and we're all theologians, whether we're ordained or not, and place that in context, then we can inform the human rights dialogue, and that can inform how we apply our theology beyond prayer into action. So I think it's imperative for us to connect beyond the walls, the artificial boundaries of the United States.
Very well said. Thank you for adding that, Reverend Wynder. We have another question that I believe is in conjunction with the mental health conversation we were having a few minutes ago. And it speaks to when it was mentioned about the stigma. I mentioned about the stigma of mental health in people of color communities, as well as our religious communities. But the statement in question is, how can we shift this stigma in the church? What steps would you recommend, and how do we make this more normal and not spiritual?
Can you repeat that?
Definitely. So it says, how can we shift this stigma, the stigma that we were talking about earlier, which exists in communities of people of color and also in religious communities, in terms of mental health, getting therapy, and getting that type of counseling. What steps would you all recommend that people take to address the stigma, and how do we make seeking mental health more normal and not so much spiritual?
I think there has to be a level of transparency. You don't have to tell it all, but you can, I think if you don't embrace the shame or embrace the stigma and just say, yeah, I have a counseling appointment. I know my pastor, Howard John Wesley at Alfred Street Baptist Church, he will talk about it. He talks about it. He has a regular appointment. I know other pastors who will do that, just to diffuse some of that stigma and to not make it into a thing, but just to say, this is what I'm doing. This is helping me to help you, help me to help you, right? And I think if we can just embrace a level of transparency around it, and not allow people to even shame us about it, then I think that at least moves the ball down the field or down the court.
Yeah. No, SU basketball can't be, Okay, so, this is the thing I learned in the church context. A friend of mine, before we had gone to seminary and as a young adult. And so I think there's something about the timing of these messages and the fact that this came in my religious circle that I think is instructive to me. And that is, she taught me that I should have a council of advisors always. And I was like, what? It's like, yeah, who's the person who you talk to you about your finances? Who's the person who you talk about your legal issues with? Have someone who's your counselor therapist, have your spiritual director, and then have someone who you can talk to about your professional development, vocational, choices. And you may not need to call on those people all the time. You just need to have them in your quiver of, you need to have them on speed dial when you need them. And so it was just like, oh yeah, I should have those things. So I got those things, but those people, because I thought, well, this is a way to make sure that the things that I don't want to have to be looking for when I need them are there. And so that just set this normalizing expectation to me. And, I mentioned I had already sought out the counseling center once when I was in college, because I thought, oh, yeah, they are, I want to work through some things. So I had that, but it never occurred to me after college to think about looking for those resources in advance. And so I wonder about what the role of the church can be in terms of just saying, as we try to teach all the other kinds of life skills and things that we need to sort of be launched in a healthy way out in the world, or to pick them up at whatever point, is to say, yeah, it's okay, have those things. And among these advisors is a person you can go to for counseling. So it's not an outlier. It's just among the many resources of people who we would be blessed to have our back when we need them.
So Reverend Houston, I want to just say something briefly. I think that, I wasn't joking when I talked about the various, sources of inspiration and direction. One of those women that I look to read is Emily Towns, right? Beyond just that quote. And one of the things she talks about is an ethic of care, ETHIC. And, and so part of it is a reframe, is a remix. If we believe that we're supposed to take care of our body, mind, and soul, then we can't just lead with the soul only and everything will be all right. We then need to care and take care of our body, mind, and soul. That care, though, has to move beyond self-care. Scripture says, when to love the Lord our God with all our mind, soul, and strength, but also to love our neighbor as ourselves. It's a communal context and it's a self context, but self-care suggests that we all are equally able to exercise the self-care, and that's not the case. We talked about that in the pandemic with regard to essential workers. But there are other things that can restrict the schedules that we have at different times in our lives, regardless of vocation, location that we're in, the ability to exercise the care for ourselves as individuals can be compromised. Pre-existing conditions can also compromise that, where we need assistance in that. But if we promote an ethic of care, where the notion is that we exercise care and compassion and love, the putting love into action, the way that Bishop Jennifer was talking about, and also Dr. Leslie was talking about, then that love is also about the fullness of our being, our mind, our body, and soul. And it's not just about our own care and those immediate to us, but we care about sort of the fullness of the community. And then the way we look at one another is through the lens of care. And that care has to be in a wellness frame. And You know, Episcopal Church and Presbyterian Church, some others have these credo programs, CREDO, and they talk about finances, they talk about the body, your physical body, your mental health, all the things that Bishop Jennifer was talking about earlier, and they do it through a lens of wellness. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But when you look and listen to Emily Towns' writing, and then, you know, one of the texts, I have it somewhere here in the office because I've been trying to integrate it in my work recently. She wrote the text about, you know, public health and an ethic of care during the AIDS pandemic, and how we need, in order to address the AIDS pandemic in the Black community, we need an ethic of care. So I think we need to flip the script and even get rid of the lens of self-care as a leading, and talk about an ethic of care, where the way that we see one another, and the pandemic has allowed us to do it, the mask and the other things Leslie was, you know, talking about. So that's what in addition to, I'm not trying to transplant the other pieces, but I think that changing the lens and sort of defining it differently so that we can flourish as a community, and we're part of the community. Without the community, we can't take care of ourselves. So anyway, that's what I believe.
Can I follow up one more thing on that? And I think, you know, this is an interesting question to be spending a lot of time on because of the world we're living in. So I think it's really important. But I recognize another barrier is going to be not just where do I go, but can I afford it? And that's where I think perhaps church communities can get really, really creative about that. Because, you know, having access, I mean, there's a lot, you know, presuming you've got access to some health insurance, you've got access to, you know, an EAP, deployment assistance program that might give you some sessions for, you know, 10 sessions a year for free. I mean, there's all of this stuff that I'm going, yeah, that's accessible. And also it's not, there's some real barriers. So I want to acknowledge that those are, like, if you make the decision to seek someone out, that then we have to figure out, you know, how you can do it in ways that don't, you know, that are affordable. And I'll say this, I mean, I've found when I've been in a time when I couldn't afford to pay the full fee, like I was just willing to have the conversation, and sometimes their therapists will do that. You know, there are Christian counseling centers if you're a Christian, and some of those might have sliding scales. There are ways perhaps in which there are resources available at the church that no one talks about publicly, but they're there, but you just have to ask. And so I just want to name that the money is an issue. It costs something to go to therapy and to take care of yourself as a part of communal care. And we also need to destigmatize the searching out the possibilities for meeting those needs and finding the money or asking a different question to be able to afford it, because it's that important. It's too important to say that we can't afford it. We can't afford it in any way to not take care of ourselves in those mental spaces.
Very well said, everybody. Also, I wanted to just chime in, Bishop Jennifer, on what you were saying about the cost. That usually is a hindrance to various people groups. And I was going to mention that most therapists do offer a sliding scale. And also, as an ethical responsibility, clinical mental health counselors are encouraged to have some pro bono clients. We should be willing, of course, we need and want to get paid, but at the same time, we're supposed to supply and provide a service as clinical mental health counselors, if that's your profession. And so we want to continue to focus on taking care of and keeping the client safe and making sure that cost is not a tremendous hindrance to people getting what they need from a mental and emotional health standpoint. Wonderful, wonderful. This next question, I want to make sure we get this question in. It came from someone very near and dear to us. I'm not going to say her name, but her initials are RV. But anyway, and the question is, she basically wanted to know the opinion, whether the panelists are disappointed in the church as a whole in matters of race. And then the question posed after that was, how can there be racism in the church?
Part 2 of this panel will continue.
I got time. But wait a minute, how can there, I mean, context is important, right? Like, how can there be
Right.
racism in the church? Are we in America? So like in my denomination, we are, oh my God, how to say this succinctly? So mainline denomination founded in the earliest days of the, founding of this country, even though people were here. You get that, right? And so this church is now wrestling with, and Chuck has been a part of this work in a deep, deep way. Like, we're finally, I think, have moved the needle a little bit, and being able to talk out loud with our mouths and say, we are a white supremacist institution and we need to repent, repair, and restore the church into the body that God has desired from the very beginning. We could not say that in those words 30 years ago, even in the midst of the civil rights era. I mean, so I'm glad about that. But until we are able to root out at its very core the white supremacist structures that form this country, if we have a church in this country, it is going to either be racist or subject to racism. So if that's not what you mean, then I'll be able to clarify, but that's kind of my presupposition on that at the moment. It's just.
And a
Yeah,
lot of.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was just going to say,
ahead.
this is a whole nother panel, but go ahead, Reverend Copeland.
It's a whole nother panel. But so I work for the National Council of Churches and 38 member denominations, including the Episcopal Church and Baptist, historically African-American denominations, Orthodox, mainline Protestant. And it is quite interesting how there are a lot of cultural Christians, and unfortunately, a lot of times the church has been influenced by the culture more than influencing the culture. And so we live with the fact, and I think Bishop Jennifer said it well, the church, American church, woven into its fabric is colonialism and white supremacy. Many churches were cool with slavery. They were, proponents of slavery. And so that all has to be dismantled in order for us to move into a more just and anti-racist society. It is part of the mission and priorities of the National Council of Churches. It is hard work because, quite frankly, a lot of us don't even see the places and spaces where something other than the gospel has snuck in, right? And that we're actually really just being proponents of white nationalism more than Christianity. And so it is a lot of peeling back the onion, digging deep to get to the seed and the root of it and trying to root it out. And it is heartbreaking in many ways because if, theologically, philosophically, we would say, oh no, of course the church isn't racist. But in actual fact, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we are anti-racist and that we are doing that work so that we live out, I think, what God has called, who God has called us to be.
And I also think, sorry, Bishop.
No, you go. Yeah, you go.
I also think that we have to work, as we work on that, we also need to, I think Bishop Jennifer said, either our races are impacted by racism and white supremacy. And so therefore we have also a lot of work to do around ensuring that we don't replicate the same anti-Blackness, within our churches, whether they be Black churches in historically, Black denominations or Black congregations who exist in the Episcopal Church or the Lutheran Church or, whatever it is, the context, that we don't replicate it through our liturgy, through our hymns, white as snow, that, we have to also do that work as well, because then our ability to be, to contest anti-Blackness and to advance things with justice so that we can fully flourish as Black people and as human beings is limited because our brains and our minds and our souls have been constrained in that way. And so a mentor of mine is, and someone that Bishop Jennifer knows well, Ed Robin, says, let there be peace among us and let us not be instruments of our own or others' oppression. And so we have work to do in our churches, period,
Absolutely.
full stop.
Bishop Jennifer, you were going to say something. I don't want to miss
Oh, yeah.
that.
Well, it was going to be an example of what Chuck just said. And this is a congregation in Ku Klux Klan country in Indiana, predominantly white Episcopal church, but not all white. And when they came to me this past a year ago in November and said, we're going to go back and we have to look at we're going to talk about dismantling racism. Well, we go to church and like there are all these white Jesuses on the wall. Like the only Black person on the wall is the bishop. Like we gotta do something about these images. And I'm like, okay, now we're getting to something. Like because we can talk about this internal work, this communal work, but to be able to look at your space and what we're perpetuating was a shift. And I'm going to take those little stories of hope as much as I can get for everything, because we need glimpses of what's possible for people to be asking the questions and then going even deeper with the work, and just the way Jeff was talking about.
Wonderful. Excellent. Reverend Leslie, you good? You look like you had a word before.
I was going to, but there's a question that I hope we get to about Black folk and brown folk, not, like some tension in that community. And I'm kind of hoping we'll get to that.
Actually, that's actually my segue, because we probably will not get to that. we are at capacity in terms of time at this point, pretty much.
Lila?
Can I say,
yes, please.
Just a quick word about that. When I was at the border, there was a professor whose name is escaping me right now, just because I'm getting older, but he has a book coming out on the Brown Church, and his description of the Brown Church was so close to that of the Black Church. And so I think part of what we all have to do, whether it's in a church context or any other context that we might find ourselves, is to realize that people of color are all catching it, and that there are, I feel like, the same white supremacy that burned crosses on lawns and hosed Black folks and stopped us from voting and enslaved Black folks is the same spirit, I would say spirit, but maybe the same thing that separates families at the border, that calls people to have forced hysterectomies. So it's the same kind of thing. It's just being lived out in different ways. So my hope and prayer is that we will work together and see those places of commonality, and not let division come among us, because I think there's certainly a lot of power in us being together and hearing our own stories and celebrating the places and spaces where we're different, but recognizing that there's a lot that we share in common, especially as in this American context.
Awesome. Amazing job, everybody. I want to just be mindful and respectful of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Bishop Jennifer. Thank you, Reverend Copeland. Thank you, Reverend Wynder. Thank you, everyone who was a part of this. We could talk about this for another 2 hours, but we don't have another 2 hours. And so I really appreciate you guys. And to all of our viewers, we hope that you will stay with us for our next session. And please remember us in your giving opportunities.
Our special thanks to Reverend Leslie and Bishop Jennifer for an incredible discussion grounding us in faith during this unprecedented time. We all need to remain prayerful as we address health disparities and the disproportionate financial impact of COVID-19, as well as the significant social justice issues that we're all facing today. Now, the church mothers, they always reminded us that nothing is too big for God. Amen? Amen. So let's remember that. Now, our next session is a celebration of Latino Hispanic Heritage Month. And it's a book talk with Sunny Hostin of ABC's The View, and she'll be interviewed by her ABC colleague, Marcus Solis, class of 1991. And they're going to talk about her brand new book called I Am These Truths. Love that title. The book chronicles Sunny's humble beginnings growing up in public housing in New York City, as well as her work as an attorney and journalist, and her eventual rise to become the national media personality that she is today. The first 100 people to make a $500 gift to the Our Time Has Come Scholarship Fund, you're going to get a free copy of Sunny's book. So find the link in the chat and join us for what will be an inspiring conversation.